All right, welcome. We're glad you're here. My name is Eric White. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the library. As you may know, our January theme is Colorado 150, exploring our legacy, celebrating the sesquicentennial of our state. Throughout the month, we are holding talks, discussions, and fun events related to Colorado history and also pre-Colorado history. In that vein, we are excited to have CSU professor and Estes Park local Dr. Adam Thomas here to share the story of an often overlooked Colorado historical divide. But before we do formal introductions, I will just mention that the library sees as part of its job bringing in speakers to share their perspectives for the enrichment of our community. Speakers' perspectives are purely their own. All right. Now I would like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Thomas is an associate teaching professor of history at Colorado State University and assistant director of CSU's Public and Environmental History Center. He is also founder and principal of Historitecture, an Estes Park-based architectural history, historic preservation, and cultural resource consulting firm, specializing in preserving, interpreting, and promoting the built environment of the Intermountain West. Dr. Thomas holds a BS in journalism from the Medill School at Northwestern University, an MA in history from Colorado State University, and a PhD in history from Johns Hopkins University. He has led numerous architectural history and public history projects, ranging from thousands of individual property surveys to dozens of major neighborhood histories and documentaries. In 2013, make sure I'm pronouncing that right, Historitecture, with the City of Pueblo and Historic Pueblo, Inc., received the Governor's Award for Historic Preservation, Colorado's most distinguished honor in the field, for the Pueblo Neighborhood Studies Project, which increased awareness of the complex histories of underserved neighborhoods and connected those neighborhoods to funding through historic preservation programs. Dr. Thomas studies the interplay of race, identity, and the built environment in the American Southwest. He teaches courses in American history, architectural history, public history, material culture, and the post-1900 American West. All right, before we formally welcome him, I'm just going to set up our Zoom so that folks online can see the presentation. Give me just a moment to do that. All right, please welcome Dr. Adam Thomas.
Thank you. Good evening. It's very nice to actually be speaking in my own town for once. That doesn't always happen, so it was an easy commute for me this evening. So I'm here to talk about a project I've been working on for about a decade now concerning the Tortilla Curtain, which may be a phrase you're not familiar with, but you will be by the end of this presentation. This image that I'm showing here is actually a rather famous photograph by photographer Robert Adams in his book called Eden. And this is actually the town of Eden, Colorado, which sits on the Tortilla Curtain on I-25. And today there's still nothing there. And we'll get into why that might be. But this is really about thinking in a different way about Colorado, checking your preconceptions of the state. And for me, I began to think about Colorado with two experiences in mind. The first was a trip that my mother made in 1955 to visit her sister, who had married a military man who was stationed at Fort Carson. And it was a legendary trip in our family. My mother told stories about it all the time. She documented it well in photographs. And so my first notions of Colorado were from my mother, and they were Colorado Springs. That's what I knew of Colorado for the longest time. My mother here is the one leaning down towards the middle there on top of the Pikes Peak side. The other thing, and I think for a generation of us, this is what we know about Colorado, Monday Night Football. Monday Night Football, man, when the Broncos played, you would always get that camera angle where they would show downtown Denver with the mountains behind it. And I didn't know a thing about photography. I didn't know what they were actually doing is reducing the field of depth so it looked like Denver was in the mountains. So I, of course, was one of those people who the first time I came to Denver was like, what the hell's going on here? This isn't the mountains. The other thing that influenced me were the advertisements during Monday Night Football, particularly Marlboro advertisements. I had become convinced that this was Colorado, so much so that I was ready to take up smoking if it would get me to Colorado. And of course, all this leads to this idea that this is Colorado, right? Most Americans who don't know anything about Colorado think of it as Denver. They think of it as mountains and skiing, Rocky Mountain National Park. That's what we think of. But we know once you're here for a little bit, you realize there is a great divide in this state between the plains and the mountains. This is the natural divide, and it is a legitimate cultural divide. It's a legitimate economic divide. It's a legitimate political divide. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. This is a pillow that my sister-in-law has on her couch. You've probably seen these in all the stores in Estes Park, right? They all sell these sorts of things. And whenever I started this project, I was staying at my sister-in-law's house. I was just thinking about this project, and I'm looking at this pillow, and I'm going, that's interesting. I see Fort Collins, Denver, Boulder. We got Breckenridge there, Aspen, Crested Butte, Colorado Springs. There's no Pueblo on here. That's interesting. There's no Pueblo. In fact, Pueblo so often doesn't appear on these things. This is a tourist guide from Colorado Vacation Discovery. And you can see here, we have Canyon City marked. You can see where Highway 50 crosses I-25. That's where Pueblo is. There's even space. They could have put Pueblo there, but they don't. Maybe there's more to this. This is actually from the same designer who did that pillow. I actually found this on a set of glasses that I found, I believe, over in Brownfields. That, again, this one has Pueblo on it. But you'll notice for Pueblo, they have a Pueblo. Guess what Pueblo doesn't have? A Pueblo. And then, of course, one of my all-time favorites, this postcard that I discovered. It's a 1950s postcard. You've always seen these. These exist for Estes Park, vintage postcards like this. But if you start looking at this closely, you're going to realize something remarkable. It's not Pueblo, right? So the P is balanced rock in the Garden of the God of Colorado Springs. The U is Mount of the Holy Cross, which is 150 miles away from Pueblo. E is the Will Rogers Shrine in Colorado Springs. B is Canyon City, the Royal Gorge. And L is Montezuma Temple, again, at the Garden of the Gods in Colorado Springs. The only letter that has anything to do with Pueblo is the O, which shows, I think, the steel mill. But, you know, that's it, right? So why does Pueblo disappear from maps? Why does it not represent itself on postcards? Well, I argue that this has to do with the Tortilla Curtain. A nod to T.C. Boyle's novel of the same title, the Tortilla Curtain refers generally to the U.S.-Mexico border. But in my use here, I'm referring to a kind of interior borderland, an economic, cultural, political divide cutting across southern Colorado. I first encountered this expression when I was an instructor at CSU Pueblo, and many of my Latino students would mention to me, you know, I was always talking about, why don't you go work for the State Historic Preservation Office? We need more people who are familiar with Hispanic culture resources. They'd say, well, it's because we can't cross the Tortilla Curtain. I'm like, what are you talking about? I've never heard of this before. I picked this up from an autobiography by Mike Tedesco. He was the city manager in Pueblo for a long time. The county line between Pueblo and El Paso County is known by locals as the Tortilla Curtain because there's a big difference between the upstanding Protestant whites in Colorado Springs and the blue-collar Catholic ethnicities of Pueblo. I realized that this was a way to explain the dramatic cultural, political, and spatial differences when you cross the Front Range from what we consider maybe middle Colorado to southern Colorado. In Pueblo parlance, the Tortilla Curtain generally corresponds to the Pueblo-El Paso County line, which is right here. But it's bigger than that, right? This is a line that we can put across the state, and you'll begin to notice something very remarkable about this. Look at place names. South of this line, we have San Miguel, we have Dolores, Montezuma, Archuleta, right? North of this, we have Denver, we have Garfield, right? There is a different west on either side of this line. And some of you may know I-25 changes names on this line. In El Paso County, it is the Ronald Reagan Highway. In Pueblo County, it becomes the John F. Kennedy Highway, right? Just to bring up more about this. I argue beyond just being a local phenomenon, Colorado's Tortilla Curtain is a kind of fault line between two different Wests. The Anglo-Rocky Mountain West and the Hispanic Southwest. It was the invention of 19th century Anglo settlers who noticed these changes in the landscape in the 40 miles between Colorado Springs and Pueblo, where lush foothills give way to stark deserts. Their rhetoric developed into a cultural, political, and economic boundary that by the 20th century helped support profound inequalities on either side of the line based on perceptions or misconceptions of race and culture. So let's get into that invention part in the 19th century. And I think it's important to point out that before Anglo-Americans arrive in the Southwest, there is no Tortilla Curtain. There's no conception of this whatsoever. Tribes are freely moving in this territory, generally using the Front Range as the north-south corridor and the Arkansas River as an east-west corridor. And that's why the El Pueblo Fort will stand at the junction of Fountain Creek and the Arkansas River because it's already on an existing trade corridor. In time, the Arkansas River will become an international border between Spanish and later Mexican territory and the United States. That will end with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ends the Mexican-American War in 1848 and becomes the American Southwest. But all of this changes with Anglo-American exploration in what would become Colorado. It's important to remember that at the time of these initial encounters, and more importantly, their written accounts to Eastern readers, American culture is still steeped in an aesthetic of romanticism, which is a reaction against the Enlightenment that promoted feelings and emotion over reason and science. Romanticism emphasized intense emotion and individualism while it glorified nature. And this would lead to the Hudson School of landscape painting, these massive canvases. And I think this is a great example of the representation, romantic representation of Colorado. Anybody know what this is? Where this is? You're sitting in it right now. Yeah, that's right. This is the Estes Park. This painting by Albert Bierstadt still hangs in the Denver Art Museum to this day. Is this an accurate depiction of Estes Park? Absolutely not. It's utter nonsense, right? That is not what it looks like, and that's not Bierstadt's point. Bierstadt's point is he wants to capture the emotional experience of that thing we do where we come up, cross into the valley, and you just see it there. That's what this is. It's emotion, not science. So because of this, landscapes become moral. As Helen Hunt Jackson, who is a Colorado Springs novelist, puts it, climate is fate. The mountainous expanses of Colorado, the purple mountain majesties, were moral and virtuous because they're spectacular, because they're awe-inspiring. But the dry, high plains, sorry, I'm going to go back, the dry, high plains and the deserts of Colorado, what writers often referred to as the wastes, they stood at the opposite end of this moral spectrum. After all, Jesus spends 40 days vying with the devil in the desert, right? So there's evil that lurks in the devil. And this is going to become that rift of the Tortilla Curtain. Perhaps the first published and widely read description of the area between Colorado Springs and Pueblo comes from Francis Parkman, who considered himself a historian and a botanist. We can question some of that. But from his book, The Oregon Trail, Sketches of Prairie and Rocky Mountain Life, it was originally serialized in Knickerbocker magazine beginning in 1847. It's published as a standalone book in 1849. It goes through reprintings over and over again. This is how he describes the area that would become Colorado Springs. The clouds opened at the point where they first had gathered, and the whole sublime congregation of the mountains was bathed at once in warm sunshine. They seemed more like some vision of Eastern romance than a reality of that wilderness. All were melted together into a soft, delicious blue, as voluptuous as the sky of Naples or the transparent sea that washes the sunny cliffs of Capri. So that's his description of the Colorado Springs area. All right, so he travels over the divide, he kind of follows the Fountain Creek, ends up in Pueblo. This is how he describes Pueblo. We approached the gate of the Pueblo. It was a wretched species of fort of most primitive construction, being nothing more than a large square enclosure surrounded by a wall of mud, miserably cracked and dilapidated. The slender pickets that surmounted it were half broken down, and the gate dangled on its wooden hinges so loosely that to open or shut it seemed likely to fling it down altogether. 2 or 3 squalid Mexicans with their broad hats and their faces overgrown with hair were lounging about the bank of the river in front of it. Those are 2 different takes on this, and this is repeated over and over again in these accounts from the 1840s through the 1880s. And they're adding to it 19th century conceptions of social Darwinism, of emerging eugenics. For instance, in 1873, an unnamed New York Times correspondent follows the same route, and he lavishes praise on the area of Colorado Springs. Then, whenever he gets into Pueblo, he laments these houses made of adobe. He says, the fields, though rich, are poorly tilled as we pass immense herds of inferior Mexican sheep. I don't know what would make Mexican sheep any more inferior, but the towns disappear and give place to the Spanish classes, right? He's playing on race. He's playing on these ideas that it is not tilled properly. This will play over and over again and begin this divide that first it cements itself in labor and leisure over top of one of the great debates in American history, and that is the nature of the dollar. Is the dollar gold? Is it silver? Is it some mixture of those two? In those 2 decades between the demonetization of silver, when silver was no longer used for the dollar, in 1873, to the Panic of 1893, within those crises, this region is going to become 2 distinctive areas. These decades of crisis fortified a labor-leisure boundary between Pueblo and Colorado Springs. Pueblo is going to become the battleground for free silver, of labor rights, of Western populism. Colorado Springs, on the other hand, will profit from the gold standard, while a class of European and Eastern elites fortify their power with protected lives of leisure. Moreover, because the Tortilla Curtain is a spatial phenomenon. And because my background is in architectural history, I wanted to find these differences in the built environment. And what's remarkable about this time period is we get palaces. We get one in Pueblo and we get one in Colorado Springs that really stand in for these differences in these two cities. And the buildings are very different visions of what Colorado could become. In a larger sense, they're really about the future of America's political economy. Opened on July 4th, 1891, the Colorado Mineral Palace represented the pinnacle of Pueblo's unbridled optimism as it became one of the fastest growing cities in the United States and the unrivaled industrial center of the West. Now Pueblo joined this craze for all manner of exhibition halls, world's fairs, grand spectacles that proliferated in the Gilded Age. The enormous Colorado Mineral Palace was an edifice of superlatives, measuring 243 feet long, 142 feet wide, and over 80 feet high. But it was the interior that was designed to literally showcase the mineral wealth of Colorado that drew the greatest accolades. The building itself was constructed of quarried limestone, sandstone, and marble. Encrusted into the plaster walls were, get ready for this, platinum, silver, mercury, copper, specular and magnetic iron, chromic iron, pyrites, galena, quartz, mica beryl, garnet, asbestos, brucite, fluorspar, and coal in all of its varieties. And at the base of the building's 50 interior columns were these glass cases that held what is considered to be the largest mineral collection on Earth. Not only that, but the dome, the central dome, I'll get to that in a second here if it changes my slide. The palace's central dome spanned a whopping 75 feet, making it the largest interior dome on Earth in Pueblo, Colorado. It was 60 feet above the stage, and on either side of the stage were Colorado's monarchs, Queen Silver and King Coal. The organizers of the Mineral Palace celebrated this vision of Colorado, a Colorado of wealth wrested from the great labor from the earth. It was a temple well situated in Pueblo as the city was becoming one of the West's preeminent industrial centers. Indeed, in the 20th century, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company's Minnequa Steelworks would become Colorado's biggest employer and the largest steel mill west of Chicago. With its ceaseless output of rails, nails, and barbed wire, it is not an exaggeration to say Pueblo literally built the American West. A decade later, and 40 miles to the north, dreamers in Colorado Springs envisioned an equally fantastic Sun Palace, Cragmore Sanitarium, intended to be the most medically sophisticated and luxurious tuberculosis sanitarium in the world. The building would be situated and designed in a way to take in what they considered the most curative aspect of Colorado Springs climate, the sun. That was the thing, the sun. It would be an idea of recreating in the sun, of healing in the sun, that would lead to a very different idea of Colorado. Trouble here. The Sun Palace in Colorado Springs represented a different kind of Colorado than the Mineral Palace. It celebrated Colorado above the ground. Unlike the enclosed, electrically lit halls of the Mineral Palace, these private porches gave access to these vistas of Colorado, embracing the outdoors. Cragmore, seen here as actually built, became the gold standard not just for tuberculosis treatment, but for leisure and recreation in Colorado. In 1924, the National Tuberculosis Association deemed Cragmore, quote, the most desirable sanitarium in the world. The institution helped pave the way for 17 more health resorts in Colorado Springs and incubated a tourist industry in the city that jumped from 50,000 visitors in 1915 to 5 years later, 200,000 visitors. Indeed, Cragmore invented 20th century Colorado Springs, which in turn set the standard. Excuse me, some water. Clearly talking about tuberculosis, you know. It would actually set a standard for tourism. This is a quote from historian Douglas McKay, who writes about the history of the sanitaria in Colorado Springs. He says, consumption seemed more like a touristic commodity than a disease. It becomes increasingly apparent that tubercle bacillus was the city's major source of interest and income. Not only did the Mineral Palace and the Sun Palace envision two different Colorados, but they're two different political economies taking in sides in one of the great political battles in American history. The demonetization of silver in 1873, when silver no longer could be minted for use in the dollar, and the adoption of a de facto gold standard at that time devastated Colorado's economy, where silver mines had proliferated before this time. And this would precipitate a downturn in the economies of neighboring states as well. The solution, as proposed by people like William Jennings Bryan, was for free silver or bimetallism, using silver in some way to stand in or parallel to gold. This would cause inflation. They wanted inflation because inflation would actually make debt held by people like farmers and miners less expensive. And so they felt that this use of silver would cause this inflation and it would create more dollars. They're actually right about this. In Franklin Roosevelt's first few days as president, what he does is gets rid of the gold standard immediately because he knows you just have to print money, right? That's the only way you get out of that, which is very interesting. Now, with its huge population of miners, farmers, and industrial laborers, Pueblo is going to become a veritable Athens of free silver philosophers. Foremost among them is going to be this guy, William Hope Coin Harvey, who eventually goes on to be the principal advisor for William Jennings Bryan. It's his idea to build the Mineral Palace. So the Mineral Palace was explicitly political from the very beginning. This guy, I'm not going to get into his details, but he is worth a presentation on his own. A fascinating figure who lost everything speculating in land speculation in Pueblo, eventually lost his mind with the election of William McKinley in 1896, so much so that he built an end-of-the-world utopian resort in Arkansas. So, fascinating figure. He actually wrote a pamphlet, a book called Coin's Financial School, which would be the best seller of the late 19th century, and is really the way people understood the silver and gold debate. And it has all these images in it because he understood that his audience was barely literate. And it has a lot of violent images, but the most famous is this one, the English octopus, the Rothschild's fish here, reaching out from Britain with its tentacles to grab the wealth of the world. It's telling you who the problem is, right? The problem are the English. The problem are these Eastern financiers. They're the issue with it, right? So this is the political thought in Pueblo. Yet 40 miles to the north, we have a town that took great pride in being called Little London. Colorado Springs founders General William Jackson Palmer and Dr. William Bell worked to attract Old World and especially English nobility to their city. Because of their efforts, by the late 1880s, about 1 in 4 El Paso County residents was a former or current resident British citizen. This was the largest settlement of British citizens anywhere in the American West. As Francis Walcott famously quipped, Colorado Springs took to tea and crumpets every afternoon at 5, ahead of New York and Boston. Moreover, Colorado Springs was a rare gold city in a silver state. Notice when I was going through all the materials that were in the walls of the Colorado Mineral Palace, what ore I never mentioned? Gold. Gold never appeared in the Colorado Mineral Palace because gold stood for wealthy, rich Easterners in the English. And part of that is Cripple Creek, right? Cripple Creek kept Colorado Springs ripe with cash, with wealth, through the upheavals of the Long Depression of the 1870s, through the Panic of 1893. By 1896, $7.4 million worth of gold passed down the gulches and canyons to Colorado Springs. It topped out at 18 million in 1900, and even as late as 1917, whenever it was considered to be relatively dried up, still $10 million worth of gold a year coming out of this area. Almost all of it funneled through Colorado Springs and created an entire new generation of millionaires in the city. And Colorado Springs' fixation on gold and Eastern elitism even influenced the Sun Palace. Cragmore was designed to attract the elite. Well-educated, sophisticated, rich Easterners and Europeans. The physicians came from Yale, Johns Hopkins, Amsterdam University, the Institut Pasteur in Brussels. Many of the residents, both male and female, were millionaires or came from moneyed families. Sorry, I'm trying to get by. For instance, publisher Joseph Pulitzer's daughter, Constance, was a Cragmore patient, apparently quite wild. Artist Peggy Taylor graduated from Smith College and immediately went to Cragmore seeking the cure. And New York firebrand Ethel Bachrach proclaimed when she arrived at Cragmore that she was, quote, free, white, and 21. Right? And much like the Mineral Palace was a temple of labor, Cragmore was a space of leisure, providing a blueprint for the city's future leisure resorts and standing in marked contrast to the dirty labor of Pueblo. Cragmore physicians prescribed rest and relaxation just as they did drugs, because exertion was the enemy, as they saw it, and work was abhorred as a matter of clinical practice. As former Cragmore patient and renowned Colorado Springs historian Marshall Sprague put it, quote, lots of people have told me of feeling completely absorbed in honest toil during those early weeks, the toil of serenely doing nothing. And it leads directly to this. The same people who invested in those sanitaria, the same people who were patients there, would go on to fund the resorts of Colorado Springs. And this idea of doing nothing, just enjoying the natural climate of the city. In fact, this would become such a popular notion that the air in Colorado Springs, by its own design, by nature's gift, was curative, that there's going to be this concern about the indigent consumptive. They're going to talk a lot about that. That is, how do we keep the poor tuberculars away? Right? They're a little worried about this thing. Well, and then in Pueblo, things don't work out. Colorado Mineral Palace never finds any sort of use. Visitation goes down because in the end, gold wins. Again, William McKinley becomes president in 1896 on a pro-gold platform. Pueblo's activists created a community of the oppressed, however, which would lead to a notion in Colorado or in Pueblo that it needed to fight. So far we've had a rhetoric. And then we see this divide starting with these two palaces. But it's the inclusion of federal investment that finally cements the differences in the Tortilla Curtain. Both cities were huge beneficiaries of federal spending, but the differences between them and the types of facilities and installations funded by the federal government are very different. The rhetorical landscape of the 19th century and the later labor-leisure divide between Pueblo and Colorado Springs helped inform federal spending in the New Deal. Federal stylistic choices, literally how they designed buildings, were significantly different between the two buildings based on assumptions going back to the 19th century. I'll show here that the federal government's intervention in the built environment during the Great Depression, predicated on notions of regionalism and modernism, helped create or reinforce distinctive regional architecture that's going to essentially cement these ideas of the tortilla curtain. For instance, this building here. This is old Colorado Springs High School. It's a massive Romanesque revival castle completed in 1893, and it's a perfect example of Gilded Age philanthropy. This building, like many of the public buildings in Colorado Springs, was a gift of the moneyed population of the city. And it was completed in 1893, but by the 1930s, it was woefully inadequate for the city's growing population and, more notably, for evolving pedagogy. In the past, Colorado Springs would have looked to its wealthy residents to help fund a new high school. But it changes here. You see, there was a flood in 1935 that destroyed Monument Valley Park. And instead of looking for philanthropists to help restore the park, Colorado Springs got federal money through the New Deal and the WPA and the CCC and the CWA. And they come together and they restored the park. Colorado Springs said, wow, this works really well. You don't have to get down on your hands and knees and beg anybody for this. So the city is going to look to the federal government instead. And the foremost New Deal architect in Colorado was this guy, Burnham Hoyt, who advocated modern architecture for his projects. First, because he liked modern architecture. He had actually been trained in Gothic architecture, but learned to hate historicist architecture. But also because he understood you could get federal dollars if your project was modern. The federal government, at least in this district, liked to fund modern architecture. Simply put, the federal government was more likely to fund a modern style building in Colorado Springs than some kind of regional vernacular. Keep that in mind, because that won't be the case in Pueblo. By the way, you all know an example of Burnham Hoyt's New Deal modern architecture. In fact, many of you have probably been there. Does that look familiar? That's Burnham Hoyt. This is Red Rocks Amphitheater, probably his most famous contribution to architecture. Well, this is his design for the new Colorado Springs High School. What he did is he took the overall form of the old high school and modernized it and minimalized it. Right? You still have the tower, you still have the wings coming off of it, but now you have a flat roof, the rounded corners, the expanses of glass. He even took the clock and dissects it down to its minimal essence, just a hoop on the corner of the building. The architect told the Architecture Forum magazine, where they would actually feature every month, they'd have a spread in the middle that they considered to be the best building in America, best new building in America. They actually featured this building in the spread. And in there, he said, architecture is simply a dramatization of a system of construction, right? So I think you can see then how you can get from the old high school to this and finally to this, because the federal government funded modern architecture in Colorado Springs. It's easy to see that connection between the high school and the Air Force Academy and its exceptional post-war modernism. The New Deal opened Colorado Springs to the rest of the 20th century. But what about Pueblo? Well, the 1930s were particularly hard for Pueblo for three big reasons. First, the Great Depression ended up during the Great Depression, Pueblo's two biggest employers, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company and the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad went into receivership, resulting in massive layoffs. Second, as you can see here, it just happened to be in some of the worst parts of the Dust Bowl. In fact, the meeting for ending the Dust Bowl, the first national gathering, occurred in Pueblo and was led by professors from Colorado A&M, what is now Colorado State University. Third, there was a large wave of indigenous and jobless laborers that came into Pueblo because Pueblo had a rather mild climate. But this strained the existing social services. As a result, Pueblo forged an early and extensive relationship with the New Deal. And in many ways, what the Civil Works Administration, the CWA, and its successor, the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, what they built in Pueblo is pretty conventional. Here we have a bridge going over Lake Clara. This is in Mineral Palace Park. So that's the park that was around the Mineral Palace. Mineral Palace was gone. It was torn down in 1941. And you see a band shell. WPA built a lot of band shells. There's one in Boulder, right? You can see them all over the place. And they're usually pretty modernist, except this one isn't. They chose the Pueblo Revival style. Prior to the New Deal, there wasn't any Pueblo Revival style buildings in Pueblo. In fact, I wrote an article called "Where's the Pueblo in Pueblo?" Because there is none. There wasn't one, right? But federal publications said that the style in Colorado District 4, Colorado Springs is in District 3, this is District 4, which happens to be all of Colorado south of the Tortilla Curtain, that this is what you're supposed to build in, this style. In arguing its stylistic choice for Pueblo's new welfare building, which is what this building was, the WPA stated that they designed along Spanish lines, this is a quote, "The welfare structure will reflect the architecture that is considered native to southern Colorado and New Mexico." The WPA's guide to Colorado says, quote, "Adobe structures are beautiful in an appropriate setting of a cliff wall or mesa for their simple lines and soft coloring that harmonize well with their backgrounds. Yet the version of the Pueblo Revival the WPA imposes on Pueblo isn't just stucco, the stuff you see in Santa Fe. It's older. It's this idea of ruins, indigenous ruins, that WPA architects and craftsmen were designing. And I really don't know why they did this. I actually argued there's two different kinds of Pueblo Revival. There's that smooth, stucco-covered Pueblo Revival you see in Santa Fe. And then there's this, which I have called Mesa Verde, right? Why, I don't really know. Maybe it's this. This was a popular postcard out of Pueblo. They called this Old Mexico. This neighborhood's also called Goat Hill. It's gone now. It was destroyed during the construction of I-25. This was a romantic notion that Pueblo was this old Mexican settlement. This was an Italian neighborhood, but whatever. But you can see what this does is it assigns Pueblo to the past. These are animal pens at the Pueblo Zoo built by the WPA in City Park. These are brand new. This is a photograph after the construction. They were designed to look like ruins. What does that say about your city? Colorado Springs gets an international style high school that's lauded in architecture journals, and Pueblo, same people building it, are building ruins, right? And what it does is it assigns Pueblo to the past. So while the New Deal paved a path for the future of Colorado Springs, it resigned Pueblo to a mythological past. And I just conclude with this. This is where I'm going next with this project. And that is, both cities are beneficiaries of massive federal investment. But notice the differences in what they have, right? Colorado Springs, we get the Air Force Academy, pretty good. That's a sweet plum there. NORAD, yeah, pretty good. Fort Carson, huge. Lots of, a lot of employment there. Peterson Space Force Base, I don't know what's going to happen there. It's a different conversation. And then Air Force Base would eventually become U.S. Olympic Training Center. All right. So Pueblo, what did they get? Oh, the chemical weapons depot, the largest repository of chemical weapons in North America, which required decades to clean up. It was a humongous environmental disaster. They get the high-speed ground test center, all our high-speed trains, which we're famous for in America, right? All our high-speed trains tested there in Pueblo. Why is it there? Because the land was cheap. That's why it's there. And of course, the government printing office. Some of you may be old enough to remember commercials that said, if you want to know more about this, write to Pueblo, Colorado. That's what it's referring to, right? So there's not a parity there as well. So I'm going to continue exploring this and going into some front range long-term planning. But I think you can see here the basis of what would become the Tortilla Curtain. Thank you.
All right, so it is Q&A time. I will call on in-person attendees and alternate with our online audience. For our in-person friends, please wait for me to get to you with the mic before saying your question. Otherwise, we might need to repeat it. And online folks, as a reminder, you can put your questions in the chat. Who's got a question?
Thank you for the presentation. What became of the Sun Palace in Colorado Springs?
It is still there. In 1978, it was sold to the state of Colorado, and it is now the main building at University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. So still there. UCCS.
So I'm a huge fan of the architecture, the industrial, all of the brick and stone stuff in Pueblo, but it's also in Trinidad.
Mm-hmm.
Did Trinidad get hit with this same sort of thing?
Absolutely. And I think, I didn't say this, but you can generally just extend whatever I just said to Pueblo to anything south of Pueblo, right? So Trinidad is essentially a satellite city of Pueblo. CF&I is still a big player there because of the mines. And you're right, the architecture is almost identical. And you can find very, very similar situations there as well. I think there maybe even more so this idea that by the time you get to Trinidad, you might as well be in Mexico. And we see this in the 1930s. Governor Johnson militarizes that southern border with New Mexico. And he essentially says, well, Trinidad's on the front lines of this, of ending this Mexican migration into Colorado.
So one of my closet hobbies is tracking down hand-carved sandstone headstones, Spanish, and the line for those is this line, which I'm finding interesting and wondering if that's because of the war line and the dividing line. Because north of there, there's not a Spanish headstone I can find north of there, but from there south, of course, through New Mexico, there are some really interesting ones.
Yeah.
So part of that had to do with the Spanish Trail and the Catholic priests coming in and sort of invading the pueblos. And there weren't pueblos north of Colorado Springs. So there seemed to be kind of like a couple historical threads there that made that line.
That's right. Yeah. And we could, if you want to get into that early period, right, there is a significant difference in the way one half of Pueblo is settled compared to the other half that all has to do with Spanish and Mexican law. And that is the land grants, right? And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo guaranteed the sovereignty of those land grants, which means south of the Arkansas River wasn't subject to the Homestead Act, but north is, right? And so that sets up this really weird spatial dynamic in that city that gets even more complicated because the Arkansas River is the dividing line. It moved. The Arkansas River liked to flood every 10 years or so and would just change its course. And so there's all these weird relics of land grants all over the place. I actually have a colleague at CSU who is researching marriage licenses and interracial marriage licenses. And the law is different south of the Arkansas River than it was north of the Arkansas River. And she asked me, she said, why does it get so confusing in the 20s? I said, well, because the river changed course. So no one knew anymore what was part of it. Yeah.
I was just curious, you'd mentioned Colorado Springs was Protestant, or I think you quoted it in there, but is that why did that sort of Catholic, I'm guessing, ethnic Protestant, I don't.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think there's a couple reasons. First of all, Pueblo is strongly Catholic, right? And that's because of the ethnicities that settled there because of the steelworks. So we tend to think, well, you know, it's largely Mexican or Latino, but that's not true. It's actually because it's Eastern European and it's Italian and it's right. That's what's informing the Catholic nature of Pueblo. Colorado Springs, I'm going to put this nicely, was from its founding waspish, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? General William Jackson Palmer had no place for Catholics in his design. In fact, he even talks about, he had this idea of an industrial utopia. And he talks about the fact that all the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants will get to enjoy Colorado Springs, and then they'll have the other folks down in Pueblo working at the mill, building everything. But they'll all be one big happy family, right? So it's very explicit. I don't know this for sure, but I have a stinking suspicion that the reason there is a Catholic Diocese of Colorado Springs, which means there's a cathedral, a Catholic cathedral in Colorado Springs, is the Catholic Church thumbing its nose at that ethic in Colorado Springs. But another aspect of my research, because this continues, right? Today, Colorado Springs is the home to a large number of evangelical mega churches, some of the biggest in the country, right? And that comes from this, I think, the very same ethic, as well as the strong conservatism because it's a military town.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice. Oh.
Yeah, great presentation, fascinating. Really learned a lot. I was thinking also about, when we think of Colorado too, you had mentioned at the beginning how the images of the mountains and Denver and the skiing. I suppose, is there also kind of a line when we think of Colorado going east, because there's all of our, you know, agricultural lands, and that was also thought of the Great American Desert, and we saw on the map the Dust Bowl affected southeastern Colorado so tremendously. So was there also, in terms of kind of that historic investment and maybe federal investment, that dichotomy as we kind of look to eastern Colorado versus more central Colorado where we are?
Yeah, I think there is. Actually, another one of my colleagues wrote the book on this. So I would refer you to the work of Doug Shefflin. But yes, there is a difference there. We have to remember that Arkansas River line, right? That continues to be, to this day, a significant cultural barrier, right? And so southern Colorado, far out on the plains, received, in many ways, I would say, an abundance of federal support because it was seen as being so necessary, that they're hit so hard, not just that they're hit hard by the Dust Bowl, but because because they have so much need there. There's an idea that the north of that, the farmers and ranchers are more industrious. They're more independent. You don't need as much support. And there's a difference there because so much of, at least cultivation that's going on in northeastern Colorado is sugar beets, which are, you know, that's a whole different story of how that all works. But sugar beets really are only present in the Arkansas Valley, right along the river in southern Colorado. And again, the sugar beet farms have gotten support since the 1890s that they hadn't seen in southern Colorado.
We have a question from online. Will the curtain begin to change with economic factors, AI, climate change, etc.?
Oh, that is an interesting question. I think it has always changed. I don't think it's been a stagnant concept in any sort of way. I do think, and I don't know if I'm as convinced as this as I was, but there was about 5 years ago a moment when it was clear that the area south of Colorado Springs was the last vestige of affordability in Colorado. And you still have easy access to the mountains, right? From Pueblo, you can easily get to Lake Pueblo. You can get to Wolf Creek, those resorts that are in the southern part, which are, fantastic ski resorts. So you can have all the amenities in the rest of the state, but with a lot more affordability. And notably, I was beginning to see this in Trinidad. Trinidad was really having a revival, particularly in their downtown, which I think is still going on. It just hasn't been that much in Pueblo. Pueblo's better, but it's not there. With climate change, I actually think, that's harder for Southern Colorado. That will certainly have a negative effect. And it's already going to be, this idea that you're hitting the desert whenever you cross over into Pueblo, which is not actually true. It's actually semi-arid. It's not desert. But that's going to become a tougher challenge. I think AI, data centers, it means people can choose to live wherever they want. And they're going to be able to increasingly work wherever they want. I am concerned that data centers themselves seem to be doing the same thing that other industries have done, where they prey on the poorest people. I'm from Western Pennsylvania, and I'm seeing a lot of them in the Ohio Valley and places like that, where they're using an exorbitant amount of electricity and water. And it seems to be the same people who were affected by the coal mines and everything else. And I would worry about Pueblo in that case as well, right? It's a pretty logical place to put in a data center. And Pueblo, the city of Pueblo, has remarkable access to water. It doesn't seem like it, but they actually assumed that the city, I forget the exact figures, but it would be a city of 1 million people. So they bought water rights based on that. So I would worry about how that'll affect it as well. But yeah, I don't know. That's a question I want to mull over as I complete this project. What exactly is going to happen with the Tortilla Curtain?
All right. Well, we are right about at our time. Let's give Dr. Thomas another hand.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
I will sneak up here for some thank yous and announcements. Adam, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. And I want to thank all of you for joining us as well with your good questions. I want to thank the Friends of the Library Foundation for supporting everything we do. Just a quick note about some upcoming programs. On Wednesday evening, we will have Fred Mosqueda, Southern Arapaho tribal historian and elder, joining us online to talk about Arapaho history and culture, especially with respect to Colorado. On Thursday evening, we'll have Donald White, Ute Mountain Ute elder and retired park ranger, who actually worked at Rocky Mountain National Park for a bit, joining us here at the library to talk about Ute history. And then on Saturday afternoon, Dr. Rachel Gross, CU Denver professor of history, will join us to talk about the history of the outdoor gear industry in Colorado. And after that talk, we'll have a little pop-up museum. You can bring a piece of beloved gear and share its story. I will send out an email to everyone who registered with a survey. I would love it if you could fill that out. Let us know what you thought of the program. And that's it. Have a great evening, everyone.